Welcome to my video on the SAT reading section. This is an introductory video. Now we'll cover a couple of general strategies and tips for answering the SAT reading questions. There will be videos that follow this which will discuss specific questions and strategies for answering them. But till then, welcome to this video for general tips and strategies to answer questions that are pretty direct, that rely on explicit material. It's very important that we know the structure of the SAT test before we start our preparations, and so that's what we're going to look at first. The SAT reading section covers 52 questions that need to be answered in 65 minutes across 5 passages or sections. Each passage or section will contain 10 or 11 questions. Out of your 60 minutes, it's generally advisable that you spend an equal amount of time in each section. So that works out to be 13 minutes per passage or 13 minutes per section. Though personally, I would advise there is one section that involves 2 passages, and the questions generally come with regards to a comparison between the 2 passages here, because you do need to read 2 and you do need to understand 2 passages quite well. They're generally on civil rights issues. I suggest you take 15 or 6 plus minus 1 minutes on that, so you take a bit of extra time for that. And you can make up for this by reducing the amount of time you take in your data passages, because they're very easy, they're very direct in general, and generally only rely on explicit matter. There is very few questions that you have to answer based on implicit understanding, which makes it very easy and very quick to go through each of these questions and answer them correctly, so you can make up for the lost time over there. Ideally, for each passage, you should not be using more than a third of your time reading, so you should not spend more than 3 to 4 minutes of your time reading for each passage, because ideally when you're going to read the questions, you're going to definitely find a couple of questions where you need to look back at the passage. That takes time. And ideally, you're also trying to leave at least a minute for each question, so that's 52 minutes gone. So this means you have 30 minutes as a whole to read all the passages. But given that not all the questions will require the entire minute, you can stretch this to say 15 or 16 minutes perhaps. But yes, ideally that's how much time you do have to actually read the passages. Now, one habit you should get into is check your time remaining after each passage. So after you've answered all the questions for that particular section, check how much time is remaining and divide your time accordingly, such that you do finish your test, because there is no negative marking in the SAT, and it's best that you have an answer for all your questions. So it's best that you at least attempt each and every section and do not leave one blank. So keep on checking your time after each section to make sure you can answer all of them. Now, rechecking is something that will influence how you spend your time and your strategies with respect to time. What most advisories say is you should leave time to recheck. I honestly think you should try to get each question right in one try, because getting time to recheck, if you were to recheck in that manner, it would cut out a lot from your 65 minutes. You would be left with perhaps 50, because you need at least 15 minutes to recheck 52 questions, and that is quite a bit of your time. I think the effort you should be making over here is to ensure that each time you answer a question, it is correct, and that when you're reading, you're understanding and not just blankly looking at text, because that will save you time, and it will save you the number of times you actually need to look back in the passage. The only form of rechecking I really advise you save time for is ensuring that you have answered all the questions, so ensuring you have left none of your questions blank, and that's about it. Now, in terms of direct questions, that is the only tip you need. Make sure you understand when you read the question. You should not be going back to the text to answer questions that rely on explicit matter. because if that's what you're doing, that means you haven't completely absorbed the passage in your in your read, and therefore you're not reading very effectively, and that will not only hurt your score but will hurt the amount of time you have to actually do your SATs. So make sure you actually understand and invest yourself in the passage, and that you do not actually need to keep on going back to find the answers for the explicit questions all the time. So when I mean direct questions, they'll ask something like, why is X a problem? What statement is supported by the passage? What is the central tension in a passage? What a significant advantage or disadvantage of something is? This is a very straightforward and a question that often relies on explicit content, and you should not be going back to the passage every time to answer these kind of questions. Now, just quick tips that concern the overall SAT in general. Always read the italicized introduction. They will give you context about what you're reading. You might want to skip them and just read the passage, but it's only 1 or 2 lines, doesn't hurt, and will give you context of what you're reading and might actually make a difference in at least a question. So just read it and then go ahead. It always pays to proceed by elimination. Sometimes you might come across a tricky question. It's much more easier to think about it if you're looking at only 2 options rather than 4. So if you do not know what the right answer is, just remove the wrong answers and then proceed to think about the question. Unfortunately, the SAT reading section questions are one of the things where there is only one right answer. Now, I say this because it is important that when we get a question wrong, we understand and accept why we were wrong. Because if you try to find faults within the test, you are not actually learning the reasoning behind why you got that answer wrong, and that will translate into a lower SAT score when you actually give the test. So if you get something wrong, there was only one right answer for the question and yours wasn't it. Find out why that was the case, why your answer was wrong, why the option they said is the right answer is actually the right answer. And personally speaking, whenever I look at the options in reasoning in the SAT answers, it is almost always impeccable. It's very well reasoned, and just always find out why you're wrong and accept you're wrong if you get it. You should always have a brief idea for what the answer is for 8 out of the 10 questions in each passage. You may be conflicted between 2 options, but you should definitely be able to say, okay, the answer lies around this range. It's either option A or C, or I think it's option A. For at least 8 of the 10 questions, you should have a brief idea, because if you do not, you're not reading the passage carefully, and it's advisable that you look over reading strategies, which is why I'm going to cover this next. Now, there are 3 general reading strategies. Some people read the questions first and then they read the text. This is an idea. If it works for you, it's great. You can read the text and then read the questions. If it works for you, great. And the third option is you scan through the text, you look at the questions, and then you read the text properly. Now, although each of these 3 methods are valid, and I'm not going to try to taint one in particular, I strongly recommend you do number 2, because not only does it save time relative to the rest, because when you're looking at the questions first, you will look at the text and you'll have to look at the questions again, and sometimes you'll need to refer back to the text. It can take time. Scanning the SAT does not really highlight parts of the text that are important, so really scanning may not be the best idea as such, because you may miss out on key points. I honestly recommend that you read the text, read it carefully, and then proceed to answer the questions. But if 1 or 3 works for you and what I personally use is not the best for you, go for what's best for you, what's tailored for you. If you're getting a good score with what you're doing, I'd say that's anything north of 350 out of 400, do your reading strategy. And finally, I'd say you should also ask questions and understand your mistakes. Now, if you get a vocabulary term wrong, so you haven't identified its definition, you should not just ask, why did I get that word wrong or what does that word mean. You should also ask questions like, was there any other word in the passage that I didn't know the meaning of? If so, what does that word mean? So ask extended questions to help you better understand your mistakes. And genuinely be invested in the passage you're reading. Finally, that's the most important thing, because only if you're genuinely absorbed in it will you be able to answer the questions. Like, honestly, the SAT passages are pretty interesting. You're not gonna get bored reading them, and you should be able to have a discussion with someone after reading the passage. If that's not your level of comprehension of the passage of it, you should build and work on your reading strategies to better understand the passage and to be more invested within the passage. In the next few videos, we'll be answering questions that look at vocabulary being used in a certain context to convey certain meaning, because there are around 10 to 11 questions in your SAT reading section that come from this general area of vocabulary being used in context. So that's what the next video will cover. Till then, thank you, have a good day.